The night air was crisp, the city skyline twinkling with life as people moved about in their world of luxury and excess. At the heart of it all was La Vigna, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, where only the wealthy dined, where chandeliers dripped with crystals, and the clinking of glasses was as common as the rustling of designer fabrics. Outside, a man sat on the curb, his clothes tattered, his face marked with dirt, his hands shaking slightly from the cold. His unkempt beard and dull eyes made him look like just another forgotten soul in a city that rarely looked twice at those who had fallen through the cracks. Tonight, however, was different. As the restaurant doors swung open, the scent of grilled steak and aged wine spilled into the street, momentarily teasing the senses of the man outside. He hesitated, then gathered what little courage he had and stepped inside, the warmth of the room hitting him like a wave. The maitre d', a man in a crisp black suit, turned with practiced poise, his expression freezing the moment he saw the newcomer. Every eye in the restaurant followed as the man shuffled forward, his torn shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. A woman in a sleek red dress clutched her pearls. A businessman muttered under his breath. Someone laughed. Then came the voice, cold, sharp, unforgiving. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The maitre d's words cut through the air like a blade, laced with authority and disgust. He stepped in front of the man, blocking his path. I just wanted to ask if you had anything." "Sir." The maitre d' took a step forward, voice low and dangerous. "I will not repeat myself." For a moment, the man hesitated. His stomach twisted, humiliation burning his skin as murmurs spread around the restaurant like wildfire. A few people reached for their phones, eager to record another, homeless disturbance, for social media. And then, a woman stood up. The woman's response. All heads turned as Sophia Green, a woman in her late 30s, abandoned her seat at a nearby table. Her waitress had just placed her meal in front of her, a steaming plate of lamb and rosemary potatoes, but she ignored it. Instead, she walked toward the beggar. "Wait." Her voice was steady but firm, cutting through the tension. The maitre d' turned, eyes narrowing, but Sophia wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the man. She took in the way his fingers curled into his sleeves, as if ashamed of his own presence. The way his shoulders caved inward, bracing for the inevitable rejection. The pain in his eyes. Sophia's heart clenched. "Are you hungry?" she asked. The restaurant fell deathly silent. The man, caught off guard, blinked at her. Yes. But I don't have any money." She smiled softly. "That's not what I asked." Then, without another word, she pushed her untouched plate toward him. The room erupted in whispers. "The conflict begins." The maitre d' bristled. His carefully sculpted professionalism cracked for a moment, his lips twitching as he glanced at the other customers, whose expressions ranged from shock to disapproval. "Ma'am," he began, forcing a polite smile, "this establishment has a policy. We cannot allow." "And what policy is that?" Sophia interrupted. The maitre d' blinked. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." "Anyone poor?" A ripple of uncomfortable tension spread through the room. A few diners shifted in their seats, suddenly finding their plates very interesting. Sophia turned back to the beggar. "Sit," she said, pulling out a chair. He hesitated. He didn't belong here. He knew that. Every fiber of his being told him to turn around and leave before he embarrassed himself further. And yet, there was something about her kindness, something that unraveled the knot of shame in his chest. So, he sat. He reached for the fork tentatively, as if afraid someone would rip it away the moment he touched it. Then, when no one did, he took a bite. It was warm. He hadn't eaten real food in days. A test he never expected. Sophia sat across from him as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "What's your name?" He hesitated. He hadn't used his real name in a long time. "Jonathan," he finally said. She nodded. "Nice to meet you, Jonathan. I'm Sophia." From across the room, a group of executives chuckled, shaking their heads. Someone whispered, "She's wasting her time. He's just another drifter." But Sophia didn't seem to hear them. Jonathan took another bite, chewing slowly, eyes flicking up to watch her. This woman, she wasn't just feeding him. She was looking at him, actually seeing him in a way no one else had in years. And he didn't know how to feel about that. The silent observers. What no one in the restaurant knew, what even Sophia didn't know, was that Jonathan Royce was not just a beggar. He was the CEO of Royce Industries, one of the most powerful tech companies in the country. And this? This had been a test. Final scene, the shocked billionaire. As Jonathan ate, a strange feeling crept over him. He had come here expecting cruelty, expecting the worst of humanity to prove his belief that people only cared about money. But this woman, this complete stranger, had challenged everything he thought he knew. And suddenly, for the first time in a very long time, he wondered. What if he had been wrong? The man behind the rags. The food tasted better than anything Jonathan had eaten in a long time, not because of the quality, but because of the gesture itself. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. This was meant to be a test, an experiment. And yet, as he sat there, staring at the woman across from him, the woman who had given up her dinner for a complete stranger, his carefully constructed expectations began to crumble. Sophia wasn't pitying him. She wasn't treating him like a burden or a project. She simply saw a man who needed help and had offered it without hesitation. And that, more than anything, left him speechless. But who was she? Why had she helped him when everyone else had turned away? He needed to know. He needed to understand. And so, the test continued. A life of contrasts. Hours earlier, before stepping into the streets dressed as a beggar, Jonathan Royce had been in the penthouse suite of his luxury hotel, overlooking the very city where he was now seen as nothing more than a nuisance. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows was nothing like the man now sitting across from Sophia. Then, a billionaire CEO, his tailored suit worth more than some people's houses. Now, a homeless man in torn clothes, invisible to most of society. It was an experiment that had started as a challenge. His entire life, people had seen him for his wealth, his status, his power. They never saw the man underneath. Even in business, every handshake came with an agenda. Every conversation was a transaction. Every smile was a calculated move. And he had begun to wonder. If you took all the money away? If you stripped away the wealth and power? Would anyone still care? Would he still matter? He had expected the worst. He had expected to be ignored, looked down on, cast aside like garbage. And for the most part, that had been true. Until Sophia Green changed everything. Who is Sophia Green? Jonathan studied her as she took a sip of water. She wasn't like the other diners. She wasn't draped in designer brands or dripping with jewelry. Her clothes were simple but elegant, the kind worn by someone who valued practicality over excess. Her hands had small calluses, the kind that came from hard work. But it was her eyes that struck him the most. There was a kindness there, a warmth that didn't come from wealth or privilege. She looked like someone who had fought her own battles, and won. Jonathan placed his fork down. Why did you do it? Sophia raised an eyebrow. Do what? This. He gestured to the plate of food. You didn't know me. You had no reason to help me. Sophia tilted her head, considering the question. Finally, she shrugged. Because I could. Jonathan frowned. That's it? That's it. She took another sip of water. I don't like seeing people suffer when I can do something about it. Jonathan searched her face for any sign of pity, of condescension, but there was none. For the first time in years, he felt something unexpected. Genuine human connection. And it terrified him. A new perspective. Jonathan didn't realize how much time had passed until the restaurant began clearing out. A waiter hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with their presence. Sophia glanced at her watch. I should go. Jonathan hesitated. Wait. She looked at him curiously. He had so many questions, but he knew he couldn't ask them all at once. And so, he asked the most important one. What if I want to repay you? Sophia laughed lightly. Repay me? For what? For this. He gestured again at the meal, the kindness, the conversation, all of it. Sophia smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile he was used to. It wasn't one of expectation or calculation. It was genuine. You don't owe me anything, Jonathan. She stood, grabbing her coat. Just, take care of yourself, all right? And with that, she walked away. Leaving Jonathan staring after her, completely lost in thought. A new obsession. Jonathan didn't move for a long time. Everything about tonight had shaken him. He had spent his entire life believing that people only cared about wealth, that kindness was just a mask for ulterior motives. And yet, Sophia had proven him wrong. Not with words. Not with promises. But with actions. And suddenly, Jonathan Royce, billionaire CEO, realized he needed to know more. Following the woman who changed everything. Jonathan made a decision. He wasn't done with this experiment. Not yet. He wanted to know who Sophia really was. Where did she come from? What struggles had she faced? And most importantly, why was she different? The next morning, still dressed as a beggar, he followed Sophia through the city. And what he found changed his life forever. The morning after the unforgettable night. Jonathan sat on the same curb where he had started the night before, staring at the empty street in front of him. The world had moved on, as if the events of last night had never happened. But he hadn't. He had expected this experiment to confirm his suspicions, that people only cared about wealth, that human kindness was conditional. But Sophia had defied all logic. And he couldn't stop thinking about her. Why had she helped him? Why had she given without expecting anything in return? Who was she? Jonathan's world had been filled with people who only cared about status. He had never met someone who gave so freely without expecting something back. And now, he needed to know more. A shadow in the city. Dressed in the same worn-out clothes, Jonathan blended into the streets, a silent observer in a world he had once ruled. Sophia had left the restaurant late last night, walking alone through the city. No car. No driver. No luxury. Just a woman making her way home. Jonathan had followed her at a distance, careful not to be seen. Now, as the city woke up, he continued his quiet pursuit. Sophia stopped at a small cafe on the corner of a busy street, greeting the barista by name. She didn't order an expensive latte or a pastry. Instead, she paid for 2 coffees, one for herself, and another, which she placed on a small table by the window, labeled, "Take if you need." Jonathan's curiosity deepened. Sophia's life, a shocking discovery. She continued her walk, coffee in hand, before turning into a narrow alleyway lined with small apartments. Jonathan hesitated before following. Something about this place felt different. The buildings were old but well-maintained, filled with people who worked hard but had little to show for it. And then he saw it. Sophia's apartment. It wasn't in a luxury high-rise or a gated community. It was small, tucked away at the end of the alley. She had helped a stranger in need, when she herself had barely anything to spare. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. This woman who had shared her meal with him, was struggling herself. And yet, she still chose to give. More than meets the eye. Jonathan stood outside for what felt like hours, wrestling with his thoughts. He had spent years surrounded by people who had everything but would never spare a second glance at those in need. And here was Sophia, with barely enough for herself, still finding ways to help others. This wasn't just kindness. This was something deeper. She wasn't just helping people, she was fighting for them. But why? What had made her this way? What had she lost? Jonathan needed to find out. The unexpected act of generosity. A door creaked open. Sophia stepped out, now dressed in a work uniform, a simple blouse and slacks, her hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She carried a bag of groceries, holding it carefully, as if every single item inside mattered more than gold. Jonathan followed as she walked down the block toward a rundown apartment building, paint peeling from the walls. She knocked on a door. A frail-looking elderly woman answered, eyes widening when she saw Sophia. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't have to." "Nonsense," Sophia interrupted, smiling. "I know you were worried about rent, so I grabbed a few things to make sure you're okay for the week." Jonathan froze. She wasn't just kind. She was saving people. A deeper truth revealed. For the next few days, Jonathan watched Sophia's life unfold. She wasn't rich. She didn't have powerful connections. But she was everywhere, helping everyone, from handing out meals to struggling neighbors to assisting a single father who had just lost his job. She had a network of people who relied on her. Yet she had no one looking out for her. Jonathan had never felt guilt like this before. He had always believed money was the ultimate power, that wealth was what made a difference in people's lives. But Sophia was proving him wrong every single day. She had no fortune, no influence, no empire, and yet, she had done more good than he ever had. And suddenly, his billions felt meaningless. A hard truth he couldn't ignore. Jonathan sat on the curb that evening, the weight of everything he had seen pressing down on him. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, advisors, board members, business partners. But none of them had ever challenged him like Sophia had. And she didn't even know who he was. Would she have helped him if she had known he was a billionaire? Would she have treated him the same way? Jonathan didn't know. But he wanted to find out. And for the first time in his life, it wasn't about proving a point. It was about understanding a woman who had changed everything. The next step, a decision that would change everything. Jonathan knew what he had to do next. He couldn't just sit and watch anymore. It was time to step back into her world, but this time, not as a silent observer. It was time to walk into her life and see what she saw, feel what she felt. And that meant getting closer to her. Much closer. But first, he had to find a way into her world. And he had an idea. A new plan, a bold move. Jonathan sat at a quiet cafe, his mind racing. Everything he had believed about the world, about people, kindness, and selflessness, was crumbling before him. He had built a billion-dollar empire by believing in one thing: people were only motivated by self-interest. And yet, Sophia had proven him wrong at every turn. She had helped him without expecting anything in return. She had sacrificed for others even when she had nothing to give. And the more he learned about her, the more he realized. She was the wealthiest person he had ever met. Not in money. But in character, integrity, and heart. Jonathan wanted to help her, to pull her out of her struggles, to make sure she never had to worry about rent, bills, or her next meal again. But he knew one thing for sure. If he just threw money at her, she'd never accept it. So, he needed a different approach. stepping into her world. Jonathan had no experience being poor. He had no idea what it was like to struggle for every dollar, to choose between food and electricity, to carry the weight of other people's burdens on his back every single day. And so, for the first time in his life, he decided to learn. He needed to step fully into Sophia's world. Not as an observer. Not as a billionaire in disguise. But as someone who wanted to understand the life she lived. A humble job. The first step. Finding work. He had billions at his fingertips, yet he was about to apply for a minimum wage job. It was a humbling experience, standing in line at a local diner, filling out a paper application, waiting for someone to judge his worth based on nothing but the way he looked. The manager, an older man named Greg, glanced him over with skepticism. "You ever washed dishes before?" Greg asked, arms crossed. Jonathan hesitated. He had a staff of 20 people who cleaned his mansion daily. "No," he admitted. Greg sighed. "Well, can you show up on time?" Jonathan nodded. "Can you take orders from a boss?" Another nod. Greg studied him for a moment. Then he grabbed an apron. "Fine. You start tomorrow." A life he never knew. The next day, Jonathan arrived at 5 a.m. sharp, ready for his first shift. He had closed million-dollar deals, led teams of brilliant engineers, and negotiated with powerful world leaders. But nothing had ever humbled him like scrubbing dishes in the back of a hot kitchen. The work was exhausting. His arms ached within the first hour. The smell of grease clung to his clothes. And yet, he saw something he never had before. The people here weren't just workers. They were fighters. Single mothers trying to make ends meet. Elderly men who had no retirement savings. Students juggling classes and shifts, dreaming of a better life. And yet, despite all the hardship, they laughed. They joked. They cared for each other. It wasn't just a job. It was a family. And for the first time, Jonathan felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of his wealth, but because of who he was. A shocking encounter. After his shift ended, he walked back towards Sophia's apartment, wiping the sweat from his brow. Just as he turned the corner, he stopped. Sophia was there, arguing with her landlord. Jonathan quickly stepped back, staying out of sight. "I just need a little more time," she pleaded. The landlord, a short, balding man, scoffed. "Sophia, I've been more than patient. You're 3 months behind. If you can't pay by Friday, you're out." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. This woman had done nothing but give, and yet she was the one on the verge of losing everything. Sophia exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I understand. I'll figure it out." Jonathan's mind raced. He could fix this with a single phone call. He could pay her rent for years without even noticing the money was gone. But he knew she'd never accept charity. He needed to find another way. The breaking point. That night, Jonathan sat outside Sophia's building, watching the light in her small apartment flicker. She had been strong for so long. But even strong people have breaking points. And when she finally did, Jonathan would be there. Not to rescue her. Not to throw money at her problems. But to stand beside her. Because for the first time in his life, he knew what truly mattered. And it wasn't wealth. A quiet storm before the chaos. Jonathan sat outside Sophia's apartment, the cold seeping into his bones. It had been weeks since he started truly living this life, working minimum wage, struggling to afford basic things, and seeing firsthand what it meant to fight for survival. And now, for the first time in years, he felt alive. It wasn't the kind of thrill he got from closing billion-dollar deals or seeing his name in Forbes. It was something much deeper, a sense of purpose, of connection. But with that realization came a problem. He was running out of time. His company was expecting him back soon. His board members were already questioning his absence. If he didn't return, there would be consequences, investors would panic, stocks would fall, people would start digging for answers. He had planned for this experiment to last a few days, maybe a week. But then he met Sophia Green. And now, he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without doing something that truly mattered. Not without helping her. But how? She had already refused charity. He couldn't just write a check and make her problems disappear. She had pride, integrity, and strength, things money couldn't buy. If he wanted to help her, he had to do it in a way that she would accept. And that meant being careful. Because one wrong move could destroy everything. A risky move, an offer she can't refuse? The next morning, Jonathan took a deep breath and knocked on Sophia's door. A few seconds later, the door swung open. Sophia blinked in surprise. "Jonathan?" He forced a nervous smile. "Hey." She folded her arms. "What are you doing here?" "I need a favor," he blurted. Her eyebrows rose. "A favor?" Jonathan nodded. It was a gamble, but it was his only shot. "I need a job," he said. Sophia frowned. "You have a job. You work at the diner, remember?" Jonathan exhaled. "Yeah, but I need something else. Something that actually makes a difference." He hesitated before adding, "I want to help you." Sophia's expression turned guarded. "Help me how?" "I know about your community work," Jonathan said quickly. "I've seen you helping people. The food drives, the support groups, the rent assistance. You're doing all of this on your own, but imagine how much more you could do if you had help." Sophia leaned against the doorframe, watching him carefully. "So you want to be my assistant?" she asked, half amused, half skeptical. Jonathan nodded quickly. "Yes. Exactly." She let out a short laugh. "You want to work for free?" "I don't need much," he said. "Just enough to cover rent." Sophia narrowed her eyes. "Why are you really doing this?" "Because I have more money than I could ever spend, and I want to use it to change your life. Because I'm not just a homeless man, I'm a billionaire, and you're the only person I've ever met who doesn't care about that. Because I need you to teach me what it means to be human again." But instead, he just shrugged. "I just want to do something that matters." Sophia studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said. Jonathan felt a rush of relief. Step 1 of his plan had just begun. A new purpose, and a dangerous truth. Working with Sophia was nothing like running a billion-dollar company. There were no board meetings, just community gatherings at small church halls. There were no billion-dollar investors, just struggling families who pooled together what little they had. There was no luxury office, just a tiny, cluttered space in the back of a local shelter, filled with handwritten notes, donation boxes, and overworked volunteers. And yet, Jonathan had never felt more fulfilled in his life. Sophia worked harder than anyone he had ever known. Every hour of her day was dedicated to others. She was a force of nature. And Jonathan was in awe of her. But the more time he spent in her world, the more he realized something disturbing. Sophia wasn't just struggling. She was drowning. The shelter's funds were running dry. The donations weren't enough to cover rent. If something didn't change soon, everything she had built would collapse. And then, one night, Jonathan overheard a conversation that changed everything. The threat that changed everything. It was late. Most of the volunteers had left. Jonathan was packing up when he heard voices in the back office. He recognized Sophia's. But the other voice? It was her landlord. "You've got 1 week," the man was saying, his voice low and sharp. Either you come up with the rent, or you and your shelter are out. Sophia's voice was tight with frustration. I told you, I just need more time. You've had time, the landlord snapped. You keep running around, helping other people, but maybe it's time you help yourself for once. There was a cruel edge to his voice, and Jonathan felt his blood boil. You know, the landlord continued, his voice turning almost mocking, there are other ways you could settle your debts. I might be willing to cut you some slack if you. Jonathan burst through the door before the man could finish. The landlord jumped in surprise, eyes narrowing at Jonathan's disheveled appearance. Who the hell are you? The landlord sneered. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He stepped between him and Sophia, his voice low and dangerous. She said she needs time, he said. So you're going to give it to her? The landlord scoffed. And what are you going to do about it, huh? You're just another nobody. Jonathan gritted his teeth. For now, maybe. But if this man knew who he was really dealing with, he wouldn't have dared to speak like that. Sophia placed a hand on Jonathan's arm, shaking her head slightly. It's fine, she murmured. I can handle this. Jonathan wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her the truth, to make everything better with a single phone call. But he knew, if he did that now, she'd never forgive him. And so, for now, he said nothing. But in his mind, he was already making plans. A game-changing decision. That night, Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his small rented room. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't let this happen. And so, he made a decision. He was done pretending. It was time to show Sophia who he really was. Not to save her. Not to impress her. But because, for the first time in his life, he wanted to use his wealth for something truly meaningful. And if she refused his help, he'd find a way to make her accept it anyway. One way or another, Sophia Green's life was about to change forever. The decision that would change everything. Jonathan Royce had made many difficult decisions in his life, high-stakes acquisitions, billion-dollar deals, industry-changing innovations, but this? This was the hardest choice he had ever faced. Revealing his true identity to Sophia was a risk unlike any other. She had trusted him, welcomed him into her world as an equal, not as a billionaire or a powerful CEO, but as Jonathan the struggling worker, the man who simply wanted to help. What would she do when she found out he had been hiding the truth all along? Would she see it as betrayal? Or would she finally understand why he had come into her life in the first place? There was only one way to find out. And Jonathan was ready to face whatever happened next. The moment of truth. It was late when Jonathan arrived at the shelter, where Sophia had been working tirelessly for the past few weeks. Boxes of donated supplies sat stacked in the corner, but the exhaustion on her face told him everything he needed to know. She was on the verge of collapse. And yet, she kept going. Jonathan took a deep breath and walked in. She looked up, surprised. You're still here? He nodded. Yeah. I needed to talk to you. She smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. Go ahead. Jonathan hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a business card. Not just any business card. His business card. Sophia's eyes narrowed in confusion as she took it. She read the name, her lips moving silently. Then, suddenly, her entire body stiffened. Her gaze snapped up to his. Jonathan. Royce, she whispered. She said it like it was impossible. Like she had misread it. Like she couldn't believe the man standing in front of her was the same billionaire CEO she had seen on the news. Silence filled the air. Sophia's hands tightened around the card. Is this a joke? Jonathan swallowed. No. Sophia took a step back. This isn't possible. You work at the diner. You live. I don't. His voice was quiet. I never did. Sophia's lips parted, but no words came out. Her entire world had just shifted. A betrayal, or a lesson? Sophia took a shaky breath. So, this was all some kind of experiment? Jonathan winced at her words. He hadn't wanted it to sound like that. No, he said quickly. At first, yes. But then I met you. And everything changed. Sophia let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. So what? You were playing homeless to see how people treated you? Jonathan's stomach twisted. It wasn't a game. Sophia folded her arms. Then what was it? Jonathan took a step forward, his voice raw with emotion. It was a wake-up call, he admitted. I thought I knew the world, but I didn't. I thought people only cared about money, about status. But you, he swallowed hard. You proved me wrong. Sophia looked away. You should have told me the truth. I know, he said. But if I had, would you have treated me the same? Sophia froze. Would she have? Would she have sat down with him at the restaurant if she had known he was a billionaire? Would she have helped him, given him food, if she had seen him as just another wealthy man? She didn't have an answer. And that realization shook her. A life-changing offer. Jonathan took a deep breath. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I want to help you. The shelter, the families you take care of, the people you fight for every day. I want to support you, Sophia. Sophia shook her head. I don't want your money. I know, Jonathan said softly. So let's do it another way. Sophia frowned. What are you talking about? Jonathan pulled out another card, this one, not for himself. It was a proposal. I don't just want to donate money, he said. I want to invest in you. In this. In what you do. Let's make it official, your shelter, your community work. Let's build something bigger. Something that can help more people. Sophia stared at him. You want to fund the shelter? No, Jonathan said. I want to make you my partner. Sophia's breath caught. A partnership? Not a donation. Not charity. He wasn't treating her like someone who needed to be saved. He was treating her like someone who could change the world. And that? That meant everything. The final decision. Sophia sat in silence for a long time. Then, slowly, she looked at Jonathan. You're serious? He nodded. Completely. Sophia exhaled, shaking her head. This is insane. Jonathan smiled. A little. Another silence. Then. Sophia let out a laugh. A real, genuine laugh. Jonathan grinned. Is that a yes? Sophia rolled her eyes. Fine. But on one condition. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. What's that? Sophia smirked. You're still working at the diner. Jonathan laughed. And for the first time in his life, it felt real. The lasting impact. In the months that followed, everything changed. Sophia's small shelter became a citywide initiative, backed by Jonathan's resources but led by her vision. She built homes for struggling families, provided education programs for low-income youth, and created employment opportunities for those trying to rebuild their lives. And Jonathan? He had everything, money, power, influence, but for the first time, he had a purpose. Not just in business. Not just in wealth. But in people. And all of it started because one woman chose kindness when the world chose to look away. The final question. Jonathan sat on a park bench, watching families laugh and play, thinking back to the day Sophia had given him a meal without knowing who he was. She had changed his life without even realizing it. And that made him wonder. How many people do we walk past every day, not knowing the impact they could have on us? How many times had he ignored someone who might have changed his entire life? How many times had we all? He smiled. Because now, thanks to one woman's kindness, he'd never make that mistake again. Would you?